is Resolute and the Resolute Podcast, where we are discipling and developing men to live with conviction. I am Vince Miller, your host, and today we're in a new series on Holy Week. Today is Wednesday. We are discussing today the topic of the power of generosity. Welcome back to the program. If this is your first time tuning in, then thank you for joining us. The Resolute Podcast is produced multiple times every week. We have Resolute study guides that go along with this podcast for your men's group found on the website for members at beresolute.org, beresolute.org. Come back often. Feel free to add this podcast to your favorite RSS feed, or you can also find us, as always, in iTunes. You can also follow us on all forms of social media. We love Twitter and Facebook, and all these links are located on the website. So go there, guys, and let's dive in. So today is Wednesday of Holy Week, and I think it's a noble task to spend time this week reflecting on the passion of Christ and the final events of Christ's life. This week, I want to guide you through a few thoughts as we head into Sunday. You know, I think we often unintentionally cheapen Resurrection Sunday when we don't take time to reflect on the events of this particular week in history. So this year, I want to challenge you with a short thought each day, every day, as we travel the Passion Week with Christ. I'm going to be drawing attention to a few details of Jesus' last week, but especially want to consider how Jesus might have felt this week. I wanted to do this with you so that we can create a rich and meaningful spiritual connection to Sunday that's coming. It's right around the corner. And it's my hope that you might also share these thoughts with a friend or family members to influence their experience this year as well. So today is Wednesday. There are only a couple of occurrences on this day in Jesus' life. Jesus predominantly on this day stayed in the town of Bethany, which was just over the hill, past the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem, just a short distance away, a short walk. The disciples on this day in history prepared for the Passover meal, which was the final meal of Jesus Christ, and on this day in history, Mary anointed Jesus. With this, I want to focus our attention on the anointing of Jesus. It's one of the rare stories in the Gospels that we find in all four of the Gospels, and there's a reason for this, which you will hear in a moment. But first, let me read to you the text that appears in Matthew chapter 26, verses 6 through 13. Now, when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, Simon probably had some form of skin disease, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. So I want you to imagine the scene. There's this woman who comes in. It's a woman, unnamed in this text. We do know that it's Mary Magdalene. She's got an alabaster flask, which is a stone flask. Inside of it, extremely expensive ointment or oil or perfume. And Jesus is reclining at a table, meaning he's probably eating, he's relaxing. This is, for the most part, a silent day in the Passion Week. And so Jesus is relaxing before the incidents that follow next. Verse 8, and when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare for me a burial. Truly, I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be also told in memory of her." You know, what I love about the story is the symbolism of this moment. Mary Magdalene, who's the woman, a known prostitute, has a personal savings. It is a small jar made of alabaster stone containing a very expensive oil-based perfume. Often this little jar would be worn around the neck for carrying the contents that it bore, although it was small in weight. These alabaster jars were very small. It held very expensive perfume, well over an entire year's worth of wages. In today's commodity, this would be perfume priced at approximately $50,000, right? Mary takes this and anoints Jesus with it, as was an appropriate custom. Now, since this story appears in all the other Gospels, we can learn of a few other details, which I would encourage you to do today. Pick up God's Word and find a few other occurrences of this story in the Gospels. But really, the essence of the story is here. Now, there's a few things that have always captivated about me, about this story. For me, first, the symbolism in the pouring out of something to Mary that was valued onto someone of greater value. There's just such powerful symbolism here. Mary, who was known for being a woman who lived a sinful life, which is just another way to say that she was a prostitute, at this moment takes everything that was once valuable to her and pours it out onto Jesus. And while I don't want to over-allegorize this text, how can we miss the picture of Mary surrendering her occupational earnings from being a prostitute and the scent of allurement from her former life completely upon Jesus? I mean, she takes all of this and pours it out upon Jesus. This is a sign of deep generosity, but also one of generosity that flows from deep gratitude. Second, we must see the contrast in the disciples' response to the action. What the disciples perceive in this act is solely the monetary value of the contents, not the reason for and in this particular act. To them, it is value wasted. And because they have a confirmation bias about money, as we know for sure Judas does, they miss the incredible beauty of Mary's gesture. But third, there's another story unfolding inside of this one that is not yet realized by any observer. And that is how this sacrificial act connects with the sacrifice of Jesus. In just hours, Jesus would make a far more valuable sacrifice that would spill out his blood on the cross, which was also misunderstood by the disciples. And I'm sure later they would all look back on both of these sacrificial acts with prophetic gratitude at the extent of the generosity. But men, please do not miss the point. It is that we often have no idea how powerful our sincere, willing, and sacrificial generosity will play in the greater story of the kingdom. You know, in 2002, I was working as an area director for a youth ministry called Young Life. Young Life is a community outreach ministry that seeks to share Christ with junior high and high school students. I had planted a branch in the southeast metro of the Twin Cities, and our program was flying. Within a couple of years, we were experiencing significant success. Hundreds of kids were coming to weekly gatherings, and we were looking to expand. Everything we did seemed to succeed. Hundreds and hundreds went to our camps and ski trips, and new high school campuses were experiencing youth ministry, some for the very first time. There was only one thing that wasn't working. It was the financial support, of course. True to every nonprofit, right? Money was slim for everyone due to the events on September 11th, 2001, which we all remember, which led to this economic standstill. Now, it took time for this economic slowdown to catch up to us, but when it did, it was painful. Before we knew it, We were $18,000 in debt as a bare bones ministry, and yet the ministry was booming. It was not a small undertaking to try to raise money for this deficit, plus what was needed to bring operating back into the black again. Therefore, it was time for a radical decision, really. And since the only paid staff person was me, the only option to deal with the cascading deficit was to eliminate my salary completely. This period was a difficult time for my wife and me. We were a one-income family, and taking this type of financial lead was going to be painful for us. In leaving, I would be putting the ministry I loved on hold, and since I was the only fundraising agent at the time, this looked like an impossible situation for me. We had 2 young children, and my wife was actually pregnant with our third. It was a moment full of all kinds of anxiety and fear. You know, it's hard to even explain to you how much fear was present to me in that moment. Everything was racing through our heads: finances, bills, health coverage, the future, debt, work, children, and a child on the way. We had never experienced a moment like that before. Our fears were countless, and these often led to disagreements in our marriage and with God. You know, after difficult discussions, my wife and I decided to make a change. I would take 3 months off and work labor on a construction team, and then we would evaluate the future of the ministry if the money came in. I have to tell you, those 3 months were painful on our marriage, very painful. To just hold the income level that I had been making, I had to manage long and physically exhausting days working on a demolition crew. Even though I was thankful for the job, I went to work very, very early in the morning and came home late in the evening, often exhausted from the day. I usually would jump right in the shower and then head off to bed. I felt like I missed 3 months of my life with my wife and kids during those days, which took my anxiety to a new level. Anger. Since my anxiety was high, this led to some bizarre conversations with God. For example, one day I was driving home from work so tired, so worn out, that I had an out loud discussion with God about the current situation. I'm not quite sure how this looked as I made the drive, but I didn't care. I remember ending one of my sentences with God with a grievance. It went something like this: "After all that I've done for you, this is how you treat me?" I'll never forget making that statement to God. And you know what? After I made it, I didn't feel much better. In fact, I felt a little convicted and concerned that God might strike me dead on the drive home. Well, on the way home, I decided to stop by the ministry office. I had not been to the office in weeks and figured it was at least time to pick up the mail and pay the bills if need be with whatever money we had in the account. When I got there, I made a phone call to a friend on the cell and began rifling through the mail. Most of the mail was insignificant, except for one letter that I almost tossed in the garbage. Almost tossed it in the garbage. But since I was stuck at the desk on the phone, I decided to kill a few seconds and open the letter. The letter was from a local law office, and to me it looked really inconsequential. And as I talked on the phone, I opened the letter and found a formal letter neatly folded inside. I removed the letter, and a check from inside the envelope fluttered out, landing face down on the ground. I thought nothing of it, really, because getting a check in the mail was not unusual. Sometimes dozens of small checks would come into the office each week from local donors, and I assumed that this one was just the same. So instead of bending down to get the check, I read the letter I was holding in my hand. As I unfolded it, there was a very brief note on it with just 2 lines. Here's what it said: "Dear Mr. Miller, clients of mine wish to make an anonymous donation to your ministry. Enclosed, you will find a check for $18,000. Well, this was sure a jolt. In shock, I hung up the phone with my friend mid-sentence. I am certain I didn't say goodbye to him. I then reached down, picked up the check, and then I just looked at it. And then I reread the letter again, and again, and again. while looking back and forth between the letter and the check. My first thought was, who did this? But after the desire to know who it was from fleeted, my second thought was even more troubling. It went something like this. God, about the conversation we just had on the way here. And I remember apologizing to him. Talk about feeling stupid. In one swift moment, God had me right where he wanted me. At that moment, he taught me a great lesson. I think it's the same lesson that the disciples would have to learn here. It's that God uses our generosity to draw attention to his. To this day, I have no idea whose generous gift this was, but the effects of this jolt have never worn off. I still have that letter. I still read it on occasion when I need to. And the change in my outlook has been different after this day. Through this, my wife and I found hope again, found peace again, and grew to trust God even more than before with our time and money. All this resulted from one simple act of another person's generosity that was impeccably and supernaturally timed in our life. All I had to do was receive it. But guys, guess what? No one outgives God's generosity. While we don't always recognize it because of our biases, or understand it because we're short-sighted, God's generosity is extravagant. Mary's small act is nothing compared to Christ. However, when we are generous, motivated by the right reasons, and out of the right identity, we reflect the extravagant generosity of Jesus Christ. So today, my challenge for you is this. Be generous. Be generous with your time and your money. Maybe give sacrificially to someone by buying someone lunch, sharing a gift, writing a thoughtful letter. This morning my neighbor called me because they were both out of town on a business trip and they needed someone to take out their trash to the curb. Why not? I'd love to. And why? Because these small acts of generosity are just manifestations of love that resemble the beauty in what Christ has done for us. Well, guys, that's the show. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed our time today, because I have so enjoyed it with you, I hope that you will pass along this podcast to other men you know. Just head to our website, beresolute.org, or simply just share this feed. Guys, live today generously, knowing that today, on this day in history, Mary was generous, and so was God. So guys, I love you. Get off the bench and into the game. And join us tomorrow for another edition of the Resolute Podcast.